Last week on Woke Watch, we reported that the Royal Academy gift shop would no longer stock items by a textile artist called Jess de Waals. It took only a handful of complaints from activists falsely accusing her of transphobia for the Academy to cave in and stop selling her work. Hey presto, another victim of cancel culture. But hold on, for the Royal Academy has had second thoughts. We should have handled this better, it said in a statement. We'd no right to judge her views on our social media. This betrayed our most important core value, the protection of free speech. Well, good for them, we say. Good on you, Royal Academy. At GBNews, we're very big on sinners who repent. And it just goes to show that drawing attention to these injustices can make a difference. So we thank the Royal Academy and we move on to Brighton, where the council prides itself on presiding over an anti-racist city. It's even introduced an anti-racist school strategy, which sounds sensible, since nobody wants racism in our schools. But for Brighton, anti-racism is not as wholesome as it sounds. It's an offshoot of something much more controversial called critical race theory, an ideologically driven academic discipline imported from the United States. Where else? On the surface, it looks designed to combat racism, but critics argue that in practice, it exacerbates racial tensions. Critical race theory invites people to treat each other first and foremost through the prism of race, and to divide society into classes of oppressor and oppressed according to skin colour. Here's what the Equalities Minister, KEMI BADENOCH, had to say about the teaching of critical race theory in our schools back in October.
We do not want to see teachers teaching their white pupils about white privilege and inherited racial guilt. And let me be clear, any school which teaches these elements of critical race theory as fact, or which promotes partisan political views such as defunding the police without offering a balanced treatment of opposing views, is breaking the law.
But this hasn't stopped Brighton Council from rolling out its new educational plan, one entirely underpinned by the tenets of critical race theory. According to KEMI BADENOCH, this is illegal. And although Brighton Council doesn't use the phrase critical race theory, it bears many of its hallmarks. For those in doubt, the chair of the committee responsible for the report, she's a Green councillor called Hannah Clare, has stated, quote, critical race theory is our lens for developing our understanding of the complexities of racism. She denies that it's ideological, but it's pretty clear where the council is coming from. Now, an online petition has been launched at change.org by Don't Divide Us, calling on the council to stop teaching our kids that they're racists or victims of their classmates. Andrew Doyle joins to tell us more. But before you do, Andrew, good news from the Royal Academy.
It's great news, isn't it? And it just goes to show that when people draw attention to these issues, then eventually they can be resolved. But I am slightly nervous about it because although we have these occasional victories when it comes to cancel culture, the broader story is not a positive one.
No, I understand. Now, this teaching of critical race theory in our schools to children, and the example of Brighton there, is this widespread?
Yes, very much so. I am a former teacher. I'm often contacted by old colleagues who send me various screenshots of the training programs they're going on, of the books that they have been told to read. And it's very clear that it is sort of insinuating itself into schools. It's very much already done so in America. There's currently lots of legal challenges to this going on over there. So if you want to see where we might end up, just look across the Atlantic. There's all sorts of problems going on there. And if you want to see the impact of this, to give an example, there was a school in Brentford, California, called the Brentford School in California, where there was the equivalent of a parents' evening, but they called it something like a teacher dialogue session. And they put the white parents into one room. They had a room literally marked for white parents and another room for black parents. So that,
you mean like Alabama and the segregated South?
Well, that's the end point of this idea, because it has that divisive worldview. And even in the UK, I mean, it's been tried. There was even a documentary on Channel 4 called The School That Tried to End Racism. This is explicitly a school that brought in critical race theory to its practice, separated the white kids from the ethnic minority kids. And you can see from this documentary it's a disaster. There's one point where a boy runs out of the room in tears because they've been invited to reflect on their ethnicity in a way that children don't naturally do. So there's all of this.
I mean, it sounds damaging, and if we listen to the minister, illegal. I mean, will there be legal challenges to education authorities like the one in Brighton that go down this road?
I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? Because they would argue that it's not ideological, as you heard there from the Green councillor, but it clearly is, and it's clearly political. So whether there will be legal challenges, I don't know. I assume there will be eventually, because there have been in America. But I think it's very difficult to have conversations about critical race theory, because I think so few people understand what it is, and they're put off by the jargon because it's associated with other discourses such as intersectionality and interest convergence and things that put people off. But actually at heart, it's not a theory in a scientific sense. What it is, it's a way of looking at the world. It's an interpretative framework where you perceive that racism is underpinning everything, all human interaction, all institutions, and that it takes theorists to detect it, which sounds a lot like a high priest uncovering a demon, doesn't it? And it makes the assumption that racism is systemic before investigating it. Not to say that there's not such thing as a racist system. Jim Crow is an obvious example of a racist system.
Which was in the segregated South.
Exactly. So those things can exist. But the problem with critical race theory is it makes the assumption that they exist, and it works backwards from its conclusion. It's a very much almost like a kind of faith. And when you do that, then you are moving into the realms of ideology. Absolutely, most certainly you are.
And the clue, because it is a difficult concept to get a hold of, but at base, the clue's in the word critical race theory.
Yes.
The critical thing that determines us, that separates us, that divides us, that defines us, the critical thing is race, and that you have to see everything through that. It's like an equivalent, whereas Marx said everything that mattered was class.
Yes.
That social class and the struggle of the classes explained history, explained everything. This is a racial version or explanation of society.
In a sense, because it sees race at the heart of absolutely everything, and that's the way that everything is interpreted. So for a critical race theorist, they would not say, did racism manifest in this situation? They would say, how did racism manifest in this situation?
So they assume it already did, didn't they?
Yes, and I'm lifting directly there from a book called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, which is, I would advise, if people want to get a grasp of this, that's the book to read, because it's very accessible. It's not overladen with jargon, but it really says explicitly many of the core tenets. Whereas, of course, people get put off because, all of this started from legal scholars back in the late 1980s, sort of quite interesting thinkers like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and people like that. But it's now being applied not just to the law, because they believe that the law itself was a structure that perpetuated oppression against minority groups. That's being applied across the board, often by teachers and counsellors and politicians who don't fully understand it. You know, when Sadiq Khan says that London is a systemically racist city, he's drawing on the language and ideas of critical race theory. Probably he hasn't read all that much about it. I mean, maybe he has, but it's definitely an ideological position. And so in order to tackle it, people have to understand it first. It's interesting, in the document which has been issued by Brighton Council, they don't use the phrase critical race theory. They use all the other language that is associated with it, and that's happening more and more, is that now that people are learning about it, what it actually means, they don't like it, so they've stopped using the term, because it moves against the work of civil rights activists such as Martin Luther King, who believe that people should be judged by the content of their character, not the colour of their skin.
As he said about his daughters.
Exactly. And what they believe, in fact, is that although we've got legal protections against racism and that kind of thing, what's happened is that the racism has just been subsumed into every strata of society, and we must assume it's there. Whereas, of course, the liberal approach is to tackle racism as and when it occurs, not to assume it's there from the outset.
Exactly. Very interesting. Well, it sounds like there's a big battle ahead on that.
Yeah.